friend of mine has asked me to make him a new axle for the front of his motorbike. And as part of that, I'm going to have to cut some threads on the lathe. So I thought I'd share with you the process and method that I use for screw cutting on the lathe. The method I'm going to use is what I would call a sort of intermediate method. It's a bit faster than the beginner's method, and it's a little bit less risky than the slightly more advanced method. I started by getting the shaft roughly to size before cutting the threads. So I've got my shaft turned down to its final dimensions, and we're going to cut a thread on this end here. We're going to cut a 60-degree thread, which is metric. So this little tool here has got an angle on the end of it that's 60 degrees. So the tool shape defines the teeth on the thread. I've cut a little groove in just here so that when I'm bringing the tool across, I've got a little safe space that I can stop the tool before it runs in to this next feature. For screw cutting, we want the machine running nice and slowly. Now for this machine, that's 35 to 180 RPM. Having the machine running nice and slowly means we've got more time to switch off the feeds before we crash the tool into the part. Next thing to set up is the threading gearbox. So we want the lead screw to be cutting a right hand thread towards the chuck, and we need to look up the thread pitch on the lookup table here. For this is a M14 by 1.5, so 1.5 pitch. Tells me that the selected set here needs to be BS6W, so that's BS6W. Finally, we need to set up the thread dial indicator. If I move the carriage back, you'll notice that this indicator, the numbers rotate. Okay, now that's determined by which of these gears is on the shaft. And to change them, you just undo this nut and select which gear you want. And then that gear meshes with the lead screw. And as the lead screw is turning, it turns the gear, turns the indicator. So we want to cut a 1.5mm pitch thread. So that means we need the gear with 16 teeth, and then there's this little number here, which on this case is numbers 1 to 8. The next one down, 1, 3, 5, 7. The next one down, don't confuse it, it's not 15, it's 1 and 5. What that means is when we want to cut the thread, we can engage the threading by switching on the half nuts. In this case, using any of the numbers 1 to 8. So when this is spinning around, we can start our thread when any of these numbers lines up with this little dimple. So to actually engage and disengage our threading tool, we're going to use this lever just here. This is the half nut engage and disengage. So at the moment, I can move the saddle back and forwards freely, and if I engage the half nut, the saddle now is locked onto the lead screw. So if the lead screw is spinning, that will drag the saddle backwards and forwards depending on which way the lead screw is going. And then we disengage it and we can move it freely again. This means that we can keep the machine running and disengage the half nut at the end of our thread and then just wind the tool back to the start. There's a little bit more to it than that, but we'll get into that in a second. So let's have a go at cutting a thread, shall we? The first thing I like to do when cutting a thread is colour in the area that I'm going to cut the thread on. This gives you a bit more contrast between the cut and the uncut material and shows up any mistakes really quickly, hopefully giving you a chance to correct them. The next step is to just bring the tip of the tool into contact with the part. This is going to set your datum. Now I like to just move the tool back and forwards along the Z-axis as I'm doing this, so that the tip of the tool scratches a line into the inked surface. That way I don't go gouging it in too far, and I just touch lightly. There we go. We then want to zero out and lock the dial on the X-axis. So this is going to be our depth of cut. So we're starting at 0 on the surface, and then we're going to be cutting in positive. Now, there is a way of doing this, the slightly more advanced way, where you rotate the tool post and you use the compound, but this is a slightly safer, slightly less likely to make a mistake way. So we're ready to take a scratch pass now. So the order of operations is start the machine up with the half nuts off. Okay, so the saddle isn't going to move when you start the machine. Then you wait for your number to come round on your dial thread indicator. When your number comes round, then engage the half nut. When your half nut's engaged, it's going to drag the carriage along, cut the thread. When your tool gets into the gutter, disengage the half nut. With the scratch pass done, the best thing to do now is just have a quick sanity check. Grab yourself a thread gauge and just line it up and check that what you've cut is what you want. So 1.5mm thread gauge, that looks pretty good. What you mustn't do at this point is just bang the tool in reverse and send the tool back the other way, because of the backlash in the lead screw, you'll end up cutting a different thread on the return pass. So the way around that is that we withdraw the tool in the X direction, or the negative X direction in this case, so that it clears. And we've already disengaged the half nut, so then we can just wind the tool back to the start. Now of course, because we're using the half nuts and we can move the carriage independently now, you can leave the machine running while you're doing this. Obviously not checking with the thread gauge, that would be a bit stupid. But moving this back to the start, you can do this with the machine running, no need to switch it off, saves you a little bit of time. So now we're back at the start, we can bring the tool in and put in a little bit of depth of cut this time. Put a 0.25mm cut on, so that'll take 0.5 mm off the diameter. Right, so I'll start the machine up again, waiting for my number to come around. Nearly there, ready and go! And we should be now cutting along the same line that we cut along on the scratch pass. Coming up to the end, getting ready to pull the half nuts and half nuts off. Withdraw the tool, bring it back to the start, bring back the depth of cut, so back to 0, and then we'll go in another 1/4 mm depth of cut, so that'll take us to 1mm off the diameter. Wait for the number to come round, waiting, and go! So coming up to the end, my hand's on the lever ready and half nuts off. Right, a little test fit with a nut just to check it's right. Now, I've made a little mistake here. I need to go a little bit deeper. But the problem I've got is I haven't made my gutter deep enough and my threading tool is now starting to cut into the root of the gutter. Now, because we're using this method with disengaging and engaging the half nut, I've got a little bit more flexibility here. Using the really basic method where you drive the machine backwards and forwards, you can't do this because you'll lose your position. But because we're doing this method, I can now come in with a normal cutting tool, sort out this gutter, go back, put my threading tool back in, and with reasonable confidence, go back to the dial, and the threading tool should pick up and refine the thread. So let's give that a go. Here's a little tip. Because I've swapped the tool out and done a load of other operations, what I like to do is just put the tool back in, get the machine going, and then do a cut without actually having any cut on, just to check that the tool lines up with the root of the thread. So you really don't want to screw it up at this point. So my number's coming around. Slowly. Number's there, nearly there now, and engage. So I'm just watching the tool to make sure that it lines up with the root of the thread, which it seems to be doing reasonably well. And disengage. So we'll just take a couple of finishing passes now, only taking a little bit now just to smooth up the surface, make a nice finished thread. Right, just knock the tops off because I think we're about there. A little bit of emery paper and a bit of Scotch-Brite at the end just helps to clean up the threads, get rid of the tool marks, and you always end up with a few little niggles that you need to get rid of. A small toothbrush or a wire brush is really good for cleaning the little bits of swarf out of the threads before you test fit your nut. There we go, finished thread. Let's give that a little test with a nut. That feels nice. Now there's a couple of ways to do this, the screw cutting on the lathe. There's the beginner's way where you drive it back and forwards and it takes forever. Good place to start if you've never done it before. And I'd say that this is a sort of intermediate level of doing it. It's not quite as good in terms of tool load as the more advanced method where you rotate the tool post and things like that, but it's just as fast and it's slightly less risky. Now if you're just doing small threads like this and you're a hobbyist, I think this is a good way of doing it. If you're doing great big parts, cutting great big threads with big tools, well, I'd use the more advanced method because it's going to reduce the tool load. But small parts, hobby home workshop stuff, I think this is a nice way of doing it. Because like you saw, I made that little mistake and it's nice and versatile. I could go in, do a little operation with a different tool, come back, pick up my thread where I left off, and I just carried on and no mistakes. And we've ended up with a nice finished part there. So I'll get this parted off and there's a little hole to drill in the other end, and then I'll get it given back to the person it's for.